All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is from the War Room to the Boardroom podcast, talking about transitioning. I'm your host, Mason Wilson, Global Business Strategy and Operations, Go-to-Market Ad Policy at Google, combat veteran, Duke MBA, and West Pointer. Today we have my guest, Mr. Michael Dames, MBA MS. He and I will be discussing his transition journey and then transitioning into a search fund and business school. So Michael Dames is the president of Lusk, which is a search fund, and now president of Colorgraphy. After time as both a process engineer and operations officer, he was Airborne, Jumpmaster, Sapper-qualified engineer officer. He's a graduate of both West Point and Missouri Science and Technology University and the University of Chicago at Booth. And so without further delay, I'll turn it over to Michael. He can introduce himself, and then we'll kind of get started and underway from there.
Well, Mason, I appreciate you taking the time to have me on your podcast. This truly is exceptional what you're doing. I wish there would have been a podcast around like this when I was transitioning out of the service. So this is great work. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to come on here and speak about my path. So I'm originally from Charlotte, North Carolina, grew up in a single parent household, not like the norm. I was raised by my father. So grew up playing basketball and soccer and ultimately was recruited to play basketball at West Point. Prior to that recruitment process, had no idea about West Point, what it was. All I saw was a recruitment letter that said United States Military Academy. And my father, being the father he was like, hey, we should look into this and further investigate it. So started going down the recruitment process, honestly, because I just started doing more research about the academic opportunity. And as I started researching that, had classmates and peers I was going to high school with to say, hey, this is what you could write your ticket after the end of that. And so originally I went to West Point for the opportunity to play D1 basketball. And I was thinking so much further about once I got out, as everybody sold me on your ability to write your ticket. But when I got there, why I stayed, because I like how one of your prior guests put it, why I stayed, I kind of fell in love with this idea of being able to do something much greater than myself. I liked, it may sound corny. I fell in love with wearing the uniforms and all this cool stuff we got to do in the summers. And this idea, I was a cadet as 9/11 hit. Then I knew we were really actually getting ready to deploy. So I was in physics classes that. And so as I was thinking about it, I was fired up and excited about the opportunity to actually go serve my country. But that was kind of after the fact. That's not what brought me there, but that was after the fact. Graduated, majored in systems engineering, played basketball but majored in systems engineering, ultimately ended up branching engineers. So went and served I went on to serve for 9 years, and I served 7 other years at Fort Bragg, jumping out of airplanes. And Mason, as we laughed, I don't know what I was thinking when I would go back and tell my young self, why did you do that? But enjoyed it, had a great time, deployed to Afghanistan and Kuwait. So in a deployment setting, we were looking for mines and IEDs, built a Bailey Bridge in the Korengal outpost, which was pretty dangerous and kind of on the record books, but ultimately decided to transition out of the military in 2013. Didn't know really what I didn't know at the time. So I transitioned into a completely foreign world to me. And I just somehow thought with that West Point resume, it'll all be okay, but would have done a lot more diligence, and we can dig into that further. But transitioned out in 13, used a junior military officer and went down that path. I had contemplated between using a JMO recruiting service, so Cameron Brooks and Alliance, or going back to business school. Ultimately, was a little older in my career, so thought I'll go work first, and then from there I would kind of figure it out from there. And so first company that I went to work for out of the Army was Nucor Steel as a process engineer that you mentioned. While I was at Nucor, just quickly realized that I did not like kind of this bureaucratic large organization, which is probably one of the reasons why I transitioned out of the military. Just didn't know it at the time. So got there and was going to the meeting, and I just realized this wasn't it. And so that accelerated my path back to business school. So I went to business school, went through to business school while continuing to work. So I went through Chicago Booth's executive MBA route, thinking I would start a business when I graduated, only to come to the realization I really wasn't the ideas guy. I did participate in New Venture Challenge while I was there. So I did get to pitch real VCs and go through that experience. And it's there that I discovered search funds, or you might hear it called entrepreneurship through acquisition. So continued to go down that path. Ultimately, after a couple of years after business school, raised a fund directly through a family office. And, now 18 months later, closed on a business called Colorgraphy, which we do intelligence in the logistics space, and been operating this business for about 16 months.
Very nice. I mean, a lot of great background, a lot of interesting stuff. And so can you tell us a little bit more about kind of what you do now? One, first, what is a search fund? And then two, from there, how did you go about, plugging in, finding this business Colorgraphy and kind of that whole process? Because it's very different than most people.
Sure. So if you decide, should you choose to go down the business school route or any of those items, there's this, how I kind of discovered search funds, and then I'll talk about a search fund, was I kind of fell in love with this idea of private equity, which, to sum it up for the audience, is just the opportunity to take private invested capital, buy businesses, sort of prop them up, improve them, add additional value to them. And then there's this idea that you might sell them in the future. So a search fund is a microcosm of that. The search fund consisted of 4 phases. The first phase of a search fund is that you're going to raise capital. And this capital is designed to fund your salary, a modest salary. It's designed to help you prop up your operations, so office space, marketing budget, a CRM, which is where you're plugging leads into. And so you raise this fund. So that's the first phase of it. You're going to raise a fund. Second phase of it is you have 2 years to search for a business to ultimately step in and acquire and run. And so that goes that you achieve that by direct outreaches to business owners. You achieve that by brokered deals. So business owners will enlist a broker, just like you would enlist a listing agent for your house to help sell businesses, which was foreign concept to me. So brokers, deal flow, bankers will also have deals that they're paid to represent. And so you spend 2 years searching for a business. The third phase of it, if you're fortunate, you acquire a business, that's the phase I'm in now. You acquire the business, step in and run it as the president and CEO. And then finally, depending on your partnership or what your setup is, you are working towards an eventual exit of that business at some point, probably 5 to 7 years down the road, or once you've created value or your partners decide we want to sell the businesses. In my particular situation is kind of an alternate method. We have the flexibility to own a business and hold it into perpetuity. So that's kind of a search fund in general. And I really learned about search funds while I was at business school. I had another veteran who alongside was raising a fund, and from there just started digging in and doing research on it. And it made a lot of sense, I think, for veterans. I think this is kind of it made a lot of sense to me when I was exposed, is because we were in a scenario where we were always being dropped into kind of a new situation and being asked to figure it out. And so when I was exposed to it, it made a lot of sense, because for our whole military careers, we're dropped into new roles and new companies and being asked to figure it out. And so when I first heard about the concept, I said, this makes a lot of sense. And it gave me the opportunity to kind of control my upside and entrepreneurship, which Mayshawn, we've talked about a lot. So that is search funds kind of in general.
So one, giving the opportunity to leverage some of those skills that you have in the military to really plug and play and find a new opportunity. 2, to really leverage some of those networks and skill sets in business schools. And then understanding that your gift is more in the operations and process improvement rather than the idea of something revolutionary. And I think that's very helpful.
That's correct. And I think one thing I may add to that is I think entrepreneurship, and as I thought about it, just presented an opportunity to kind of create a wealth path for my family long term. And I liked personally the idea of being able to control the narrative. And so if I was going to go out, I wanted to kind of go out on my own accord, and I wanted a kind of an uncapped upside based on the value I created. And so that was another reason, the thing that attracted me to search funds.
And so in terms of funding, you mentioned a family office. For our listeners who don't know what that is, can you explain kind of that nuance of private equity and like what that funding source really means?
Yes. So when you transition out of the military, because I did not know this, when you transition out of the military, I'll address the family office setup first. There are individuals who have accumulated a lot of wealth. And so they have decisions to make with that wealth. One, they can allow someone to manage it for them, i.e. in Wall Street or asset managers and things like that. But what a lot of families started doing, and you've seen a high uptick of this, is after the markets crashed in 2008, 2009, they decided, you know what, we're going to pool our assets together and start to invest in different asset classes. Asset classes mean that could be real estate, that could be stocks, that could be this vehicle that I'm in, that could be other larger businesses. But really what they decided is that they wanted to control those assets and manage them and grow them themselves. And so that's a family office setup. A private equity scenario is when there are individuals out there who are investors who have built a track record that will raise a fund. Fund can be anywhere as small as 25 million to upwards of there are billion dollar funds out there where basically there is a defined timeline to want to deploy that capital. And then there's a defined return on the investment of that capital. And so this was really eye-opening to me because I had never heard of this prior to business school, that there's people out there buying businesses, flipping businesses. I knew more about the real estate because in the military, we try to dabble in that in the military, but this idea of buying businesses and flipping them was fascinating and eye-opening to me.
I agree. I didn't find out about this until I worked for pre-E firms doing growth due diligence. And I was like, oh, you guys really do this. This is cool.
Right.
And so along those lines, in order to successfully manage that business and understand the search fund environment, kind of what was the necessary education or requirements or experience to really do that and do that well? I mean, obviously you have the Master's in Science, you have the MBA. Are those requirements? Are there other things that certifications, other pieces that are requirements to kind of really delve and do well in that field?
So, yeah, I think the MBA certainly, and I'll just say this, I think coming out of the military, we're blind to the fact that, yes, we have all this great leadership experience, and we think, and based on everything that West Point beats into us, that skill set alone will carry us. But I think ultimately when it comes down to it, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, companies, when you're talking to investors, at the end of the day, everybody is after, how can you help me create value? I mean, it is a pure capitalist decide, how is your skill set going to allow me to create additional value? And so I would say to come down the search fund path, I mean, your barriers to entry is you're trying to convince individuals to write, in some cases, $40,000 to upwards of $1 million checks to take a bet on you. And so I think the MBA gives them confidence that you're going to have the right, proper business acumen to execute on that. I think there is a lot of respect behind West Point and our leadership ability, but the MBA paired with that allows them to get confidence in that. I am not going to say that it's not possible to go down this path without having an MBA. I would just say it could potentially be tougher unless you decide to go down this path on your own, which we haven't really talked about, which is called a self-funded search model, where you're basically going to fund yourself, go find a business, and then come back to an investor and ask them to invest in it. The one thing that is for sure is if you find a good business, you can always find additional capital and vehicles to help you close it via small business loans or additional equity capital if people believe in what you're doing.
So there are many avenues to go after the search fund and really different avenues to become an entrepreneur and really implement that. And I think the other piece that you really need to have a good understanding to really pivot that leadership skill from what we're taught as the gospel in the military and at West Point to actually making impact and value add for other people outside. If I got that right.
Yes. And one of the skills I want you guys to be sure of when you transition out is that we are resilient. And I think you're doing anything entrepreneurial, I think that skill set carried me through because I wasn't afraid to hear a no. Like in my viewpoint, Mayshawn, my mentality was I just need to get one yes or a couple yeses. And that carried me through from the fundraising period of when I partnered with the family office I did to when I was out there beating the path, trying to get convince business owners to sell to me something they had built over years. And so we're extremely resilient. And so that's the skill set that I want you to be confident that will carry you. I just needed the business acumen in that training to kind of level that out, right? And so I think that's kind of another skill set that could help you go down, that is inherently in you that you just don't realize how strong and how much of a force it is in anything you decide to do when you transition out.
And so when you look at your transition, how long do you feel like it took you to really get your footing and understand this is the value that I bring and to have confidence in those abilities to navigate the space?
Oof. You know, I kind of alluded to this earlier. I put some thought in my transition coming out of the military. So I looked at, I had plenty of classmates of examples that I went to business school because at that time when 2004 was transitioning out, the economy had just crashed. So at our 5-year mark, people were tucking themselves into business school. So I could see that. I had heard about consulting and banking. Those are about as far as I took it. But what I didn't really ask myself, Mayshawn, and this is kind of one of my points that I would have people take away, is that I didn't do enough soul searching to figure out what it is that I was looking for. Like, I just assumed I would get out, in the Army, everybody's always telling you what to do. And so when you transition out, the power in transitioning out is that's the first time you get to dictate. But it took me a while to separate from that mentality because I was so used to someone telling me what I was going to do. And so I think I would have been a lot more reflective and say, what are you good at? What would you find interesting in a role? What are you ultimately trying to optimize for yourself versus just kind of going down the true path that exists? I think we have kind of in West Point, it's easy to fall. West Point, we can fall in that imposter syndrome where it's like they did it, so therefore that might work for me. And it took me, to circle back, it took me 4 years before I kind of settled into, no, that's not the path you want to go down. Because even though I tried to go down the consultant path, or I thought about it because that was tried and true, and I fell in love with the prestige of it, but as I did more reflecting, I realized that wasn't my path. I much more wanted to control my time. I just navigated better in smaller environments and I was chasing something else. But it took a while to get there.
I think it's an amazing point. I think a lot of veterans fall into that trap of you got to go follow the herd and go into banking. You got to go into consulting. And then you'll get the skill set and then you can do something else versus really doing the soul searching on the front end.
Yeah.
And so along those lines, I really want to understand, how did you get here? So one, you mentioned that you transitioned after 9 years. Can you talk through why that decision point versus kind of year 5, year 8, or, waiting till the full 20?
So I decided to transition out in 9 years. And I'm going to be very honest with you guys. I should have transitioned out in 5 years, but I didn't have the courage to take that leap of faith. I was very comfortable in what the military provided for me. I was very comfortable that I knew I was going to get a check. I kind of knew what that path was going to be. And so I was fearful, to be honest with you, at 5-year mark, because I didn't know what the other side looked like. And I didn't have enough faith to say, you know what, you're going to be okay. And so finally, when I got done with command, I knew that if I was honest with myself, I wouldn't have been a great staff officer. I just wouldn't have been excited about it. I wasn't excited about what that next trajectory looked like. But inherently, in West Point, we have that skin that we can grind through anything. But really, when I transitioned now, I chose command initially, and this was going to be one of my other points, initially because I thought I would be more marketable after company command when I got out, right? Like, they're going to care that I led more people when I got out of the military. And I'm going to tell you, the most humbling thing was when I transitioned to Nucor Steel, most of those guys went into the guys that went to Nucor with me to my division I went to were 5 and fly guys. So we ultimately, despite my company command, ended at the same spot. But in my mind, in my ignorance, I thought it would somehow create a better opportunity for me if I could tell people I commanded these people in the military. But again, I was rudely awakened. Well, what value can you create here at this company that's profit and loss? And so that was kind of a rude awakening. But ultimately, 9 years is when I decided to get out.
I think that's a really good point about the marketing piece and the grain of salt about who you're getting your info from. Because I cannot recall the number of majors, lieutenant colonels that were like, yeah, they care about company command. And you're like, I guess. But do you know? Really?
Right. It was people who I was asking who had never made that transition. Right. So it's always interesting to see people get off. I've met, it's come full circle. And the further they get out, it's like, I was all this in the military. And you have to have these real dialogues with them where, yes, people respect the military services you provide, but we are jumping into a different game. And now it's about profit and loss. And how do you add to that equation? Like, what are the skill sets you've built that allows you to help me grow that top line or make this company more profitable?
Yeah. And the same longevity question that people have in the military. It's like, well, if you're already at 42 versus 27, then I'm asking myself some questions about well, when are you going to retire? Or you've already retired. So do you really need this job? All of those things are very good points. And so when you left, when did you start thinking about that transition path? And then who did you reach out to during that journey to figure it out?
So I started thinking about it in command. I think by the time I had been in command, I had really had enough. I had been through enough scenarios where I was like, let me start to look at this. Who I leaned on were existing classmates who had taken the leap 4 years ahead of me. And so I remember having several conversations with them. Hey, what are you doing? How did you decide on this? At the time, I was thinking about business schools. And so I was like, why did you choose this business school over this business school? And so I really went deep down that path because I just assumed that's what I had seen tried and true ahead of me, but I did not. And so that was about 12 months out, but I did not know or start to read books until it was kind of, learn about what a sales function was and an operations function till I was probably 2 months out. So although I'm telling you, Mason, I started 12 months out, I didn't really start until it was probably a couple months out and getting into stuff that I think is useful in making that transition. I didn't know what I just knew that you could go in sales, you could go in operations. That was what I was exposed to, but it wasn't very deep in what and how you factor into all of that.
Oh, great points. I feel like the number of functions that you think you can do in the outside the military, people tend to be very limited, and it's. But
I will put a plug. I mean, one of the things, sometimes I talk to alumni and we talk about these junior military recruiting services. The one thing that I will say is if you're thinking about just going to work directly, one of the other things I did is I joined Alliance. I joined Cameron. I was looking at interviewing with Cameron Brooks, which are kind of some of the ones that at least they were out there when I was there. It might be more now, but one of the things they did help me start to do, though, was prepare to interview. Because I think as a military veteran, we're not used to, or we're kind of taught not to just talk about ourselves and our accomplishments. And that took a long time to build that skill set, right? the who, what, why, and how it was impactful, right? Like that's just not a very natural thing as a West Pointer to do. And so those folks were helpful in me getting several interview reps very quickly to start to build that muscle, because that's what it was. I wasn't used to talking about that and even looking at the world that way. So I think they were part of helping me transition, is educating me on what was out there in that scope that was obviously beneficial to them, because, right, they get placement fees and so on and so forth. So you get the exposure to the companies they work with, but I'm not going to knock it. It at least sped up that learning curve because I did not know what was out there. So that it helped and assisted with that.
I agree. I think that the challenge is, right, switching from the team of like, we did this, my platoon and I, we were there together. And they're like, no, but like,
right.
So what did you do though? We want to know what you do and what's the impact.
Yeah.
And that takes some time, because you're like, I'm not trying to be that guy. I'm not trying to toss my team under the bus or my NCOs, right? Like, no, it was them, it never was me, all that good stuff. And so I guess along those lines, why did you decide to use a JMO firm, especially, right? I mean, candidly, right? People have these conversations. They'd be like, yeah, I would never do that. And like, They want to make me a plant engineer and like, let's say, rural Kentucky. And you're like, not that, bro. So can you talk about like that? And then ultimately, like, what brought you back from using a junior military headhunter to business school?
Yes. So when I was thinking about it, I started off trying to do onesies and twosies where you network with people and they have kind of these job postings and roles out there as I was moving towards transition. I think the challenge with that is your date is kind of approaching, but you're trying to figure all that out. And so it's hard to kind of bank on getting a job lining up perfectly in time, and I did not understand that at the time, but it makes sense now that I feel requisites, right? Like, they're not holding jobs for 6 months. It's some of it is the nature of timing. And so as I started going down that path, I was like, trying to line up and find a job by yourself, it could work, it may not work. Why I started going down the JMO route is I felt like they did a good job of pooling several jobs together very quickly, prepping you. They all have their reading programs, prepping you for those interviews, and really giving you looks very fast. And so as I assessed and zoomed out, I said, okay, that seems like a good idea. Let me give this a try. I don't know that I necessarily talked to any alumni within those groups, but it made sense, right? I needed to find a job. They make it easy on you. Hey, you're going to come to this conference in one weekend and you're going to walk out and have 3 or 4 interviews. And so it just seemed like a very streamlined process. And as West Pointers, right, we're all about streamline and efficiency. And so it's very streamlined and efficient. You go, though, and as you go, and I would caution this isn't every situation. A lot of companies want military talent, because this leads me to why I went to business school. They want military talent. They recognize this gap in their succession plan as more people retire and get out of the military and retire from these corporations. They think, as military veterans, we could fill a leadership gap, which can be true. But what I quickly found out that can be overcome is that sometimes the execution on that is not as great. We're accustomed to this great training that the military does. I think I did not realize how great the military was at training us, but like, we're used to walking in and being trained on everything and with breadth. And I think sometimes in the corporate sector, we missed it. I say we, because I'm, out there now, we missed the mark on that. And so I became very frustrated I didn't know accounting, but there was really no one in there to teach me accounting. So I'm being asked to be a process engineer and cut costs, but I had really no exposure to that. We were just kind of thrown in there and being asked to figure it out. And I remember being very frustrated by that. And that, in solving for that, I said, okay, if you're going to be able to do this, whatever you decide to do, now may be time to go to business school, because at least you could accelerate and increase your learning very quickly, or you can wait it out and hope somebody will train you along the way, or you'll just get it by experience. And so it was that paired with the fact that I had this discovery about how I just didn't think large corporate was a fit for me. And so those two things are what pushed me in the direction to start applying to business schools through the executive MBA route.
And so high quality training, really understanding kind of what's going on. And then from there, I think you made a really good point about when we make that transition as veterans, I often ask the question like, oh, how well do you deal with ambiguity? And I feel like for the military, our ambiguity is actually pretty focused as opposed to broad aperture. They're like, how do you deal with ambiguity? You're like, well, on the battlefield, like I can do this type of ambiguous situation, but everything else around me is organized, so I can focus just on this. You have your FRG, you have logistics doing what they do, you got artillery in the back, you got aviation over here, and they're all doing what they do, and you focus on this piece of the battlefield, that's it. And corporate, you go like this, why, and they'd be like, how's this ambiguity? You'd be like, oh, that looks very different than what I'm used to in ambiguity.
I think that what I would say, though, is in the military, at least with the ambiguity, you have a baseline. I think sometimes we don't, I think veterans, we can deal with ambiguity with a baseline. And I think that's what business school does a great job of closing for us, is building that baseline knowledge that we just don't have when you get thrown out into these new companies. And so that's what it gives you. It kind of reinforces that confidence. So then you can deal with ambiguity. But I remember going to meetings and not knowing a P&L sheet. I was like, the first time being thrown in a job, and it was like, yeah, in the military it's use or lose. And I was managing projects, and it was like, no, hey, we're trying to cut, there's actually a cost association with that. So you're saving money in budgets. And so, yeah, it's a very, very interesting world that you're thrown into.
Definitely. And so, based on all this great experience and amazing lessons, where are you trying to go from here? Are you trying to, run this business perpetuity? You're trying to find, continue doing the search fund thing? Where do you see yourself heading next?
So, Mayshawn, me and you have spoken offline about this, but ultimately my goal is to create a great outcome with Colorgraphy. Like create an outcome, whether that's I move the company to a world where it's self-sustaining and then I move on to the next thing. But ultimately my goal is to go on and run many companies. I would like to, I think one of the entrepreneurship can present a path to Black wealth. And I'm very motivated by this idea. And it was part of my business school essay, is to be able to buy and infuse, people of color, infuse their businesses to grow. Because, one of my goals is to kind of grow in that. And so I think if you were to ask me 5 to 7 years, I'd love to be in a position where I was now investing in business with a specific mission statement of kind of infusing, minority-owned businesses and helping them take the next step. That's the 5 to 7 year vision. But, hopefully I'm working towards that. But that's my goal.
That's a great goal. I mean, I think we all, at least most of us, generally aspire to something like that, right? To build a legacy for our family that they can, enjoy and makes their lives just a little bit easier. And so based on that, I know we talked a few about some of your lessons learned. Were there any resources that you used in your transition, whether those are books, podcasts? You mentioned the JMOs. What else did you use to kind of make that transition happen?
So a mistake I made was I leaned heavy on those JMO resources. And so I'm answering this question kind of hindsight, but I leaned on those JMO recruiting services like classmates who were ahead of me. But I'm going to be honest with Mayshawn, I wasn't a great networker when I first got out of the military. So I could have leaned heavier on networks, but I networked with people I knew who were in my circles. Podcasts weren't really prevalent. I'm dating myself, but they weren't prevalent when I was transitioned out of the military. LinkedIn, I don't think LinkedIn existed when I transitioned out of the military. So didn't have those resources. I would have read a ton, though. I would have started to read to, good to great, books like that to start to build that business acumen. But yeah, those were the tools that were at my disposal, I guess, at the time when I transitioned.
Yeah, I love a good Jim Collins book. You mentioned there were a couple other books that you recommend people read and check out. What were some of those?
So not necessarily specific, but I'll give you insight because I've heard some of your podcast guests who've made great recommendations. Any of the 10-day MBA stuff, if you're wanting to build that foundation, it's great resources. But specifically, if you're interested in the path I chose, one of my original inspirations was actually a book by Reginald Lewis, Why Should White Guys Have All the Fun? And so that was my exposure in the kind of private equity funds in this world that was out there. Reginald Lewis just happened to be a Kappa. And so I was inspired by that. And so went down that path and read that book. Some of the books that are also specific to what I've done, that's kind of on a big scale. But if you want to get very tactical and practical, some of the books I recommended about search funds or entrepreneur through acquisition is a book called Buy Then Build. Great resource. It talks about just this aspect of how you can buy a book, talks about the financing, how you could get that done. Great book. How to Buy a Small Business by it's hbs.org. So talks, again, gives scenarios of businesses bought, how they were bought, how you start to put the financing together for it. Great resource. Website, there's a guy out there called Jim Sharp. He's a professor at HBS that has done a ton of research, and he has a website that's out there that can help build that foundation. Any of the Jim Collins books are great. We talked about that, but I wanted to give recommendations of the books that were kind of specific to the space I'm in.
No, I think all great recommendations. I've definitely added already a couple of those to my reading list. And then kind of looking back on your transition, you mentioned kind of the different learning points that you had, specifically to like your last assignment or your transition, anything that you would change. You mentioned one, networking and kind of planning out, but everything from your last assignment, your exit, the benefits, anything else that you'd like to highlight for some of our listeners?
Yes. So one, start networking early. And when you network, be intentional about what it is you're trying to gain from that individual. Write a note, obviously be on time, but be thoughtful about what it is that you're trying to learn from them. When I first started networking would have been, hey, I see you're in investment banking. Like, tell me about it. That's probably too broad. Hey, you're in investment banking, how I might prepare better is, hey, I noticed you're in investment banking, specifically tech investment banking. You went here. How did you help me? How did you come to that decision? So it's next level preparing to network. I had no concept of that, right? And so really taking the time to prepare for networking with individuals so that you can get the best at a time and get the best out of it. Utilize that new internship program. I would have loved to have been able to intern with the company before I transitioned out of the military. I think that's exceptional that they have that program out there now. So take advantage of that so that you can kind of get a glimpse of what you're stepping into, right? Here's a nugget. If you think you're going to get out in 5 years, I would have actually started studying for the GMAT either in my senior year at West Point or that a year after that. Because you think about those shortcuts and sets that you have that could build that muscle. That is when you're at your optimum student prime, I feel like, right? And so I would have taken the GMAT. The score is good for 5 years. I would have taken the GMAT in that year after that, even if I'm thinking about the score is good for 5 years. So that's a nugget that I try to throw out to people. Veterans don't like to hear this, but start taking care of yourself in the military. If you get hurt, if you get injured, document all of those things. Make sure you're going to the doctor. You don't have to go on profile and be that guy, but go to the doctor and physicians, have it well documented and organized. There's nothing to be ashamed of to go get your VA benefits when you get out of the military. You're entitled to those. You came into the military a certain way at a young age, you're going out of it a different way. So document those things and go get your benefits that you have earned. So I would say that, and when there's a lot of pride around that, but that's a biggie. And stay persistent with it. You may not get the benefits the first time, but stay persistent with it and get the benefits you're entitled with. That is a way that I paid for business school, was through those benefits. And I wouldn't have known that unless I went deep down that path to discover that. Lastly, kind of taking self-inventory. I hear that a lot. That's a consistent theme, Mayshawn, on your podcast, and I think it's a valid one. what am I good at? What would I love to do? What would I be passionate about? I think sometimes we fall in the trap, especially as West Pointers, as wanting to achieve this certain success and status so I can go back to the 5-year and 10-year reunion so people can look at me. But I think I am of the belief now that if you find something you're passionate about and that you're good at, like we would love to believe we're good at everything, and that's just not the case. Assess what you're really good at and you're passionate about, then the money will follow, or at least your purpose will be fulfilled. And I think that I didn't put a lot of stake in that. And I think that's worthwhile really taking inventory and assessing that before you get out.
I mean, all amazing points. Can you talk about one kind of that paying for business school piece? Because I think often we talk to a lot of veterans that are getting out there like, $200,000 for law school, business, policy school. Like, I can't afford that. Like, maybe I should stay in and get my GI Bill or, Can you talk just like a higher level overview? Like, how did you do that?
Yes. So Mason is right. If you stay in long enough, you do have the GI Bill. That's one avenue, right? If you stay in to a certain time, you have access to the GI Bill. Another way to pay for is if you get out and you are of a certain disability rating, from the VA standpoint, there is a GEM program out there called vocational rehabilitation. Not a lot of veterans have heard of it. Voc Rehab basically says, so I was a paratrooper. So one of the things that also pushed me away from my first job was I got bad knees and back. And so I was in a manufacturing facility humping around, and it just didn't meet my disability ratings. And so one of my arguments was I had went down and tried to interview for enough job and realized that an MBA was probably a necessary skill to open up kind of more of your consulting, more of your banking, more of your high-level tech jobs. It's a requirement, a barrier to entry. So vocational rehabilitation is a program that is out there that will, if approved and you have your story together, and I'm happy to be a resource for anybody who wants to learn further, but basically your whole tuition can be paid for, and books, tuition. Your stipend is not the same as the GI Bill, which we can talk about in specifics, but at the end of the day, your whole education is paid for versus the GI Bill, depending on the school you go to. And let's face it, some of these top tier business schools, some better than others, there's a cap on the funding that is there, even with the Yellow Ribbon program. So vocational rehabilitation was a program I took advantage of, and ultimately my MBA was paid for. And so then there's other things out there that I learned along the way, and people have made mention. Consortium, great resource. If you haven't heard about Consortium, great program out there to help minorities transition into top tier business schools. Barrier to entry, get into the program, then you start to rank schools, but a lot of top tier programs in there that will pay for you to go to business school. Talked about the MLT program, which just helps you prepare it, but those are some pay-fors that are out there that veterans don't even know exist.
All great ones. I've used pretty much all of those programs.
Yep.
Can't recommend them highly enough. I think in addition, would you mind just kind of sharing a little bit more about one, when you do that transition process and kind of get those benefits aligned, helping people understand those expectations, right? Because often we apply for programs to go through this process and we don't realize how long it takes to go through the process, apply for a benefit to actually have it, actually start working for you. Can you talk a little about that process?
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm sorry I breezed over that. As we know in the military, there's a lot of hurry up and wait. No different when you're transitioning and you're using some of these government agencies. I'm just going to be honest with you. You need to start early with those processes because it takes time. Correct data point, Mason, for my vocational rehabilitation, it took 8 months to get that approved. You think about if I was waiting to the last minute and applying to business school right there in the moment, I might have missed that boat. So all of this stuff takes time. So once you recognize you're eligible for the benefit, you need to backwards plan. If I'm expecting to apply first round in October and I start in September, it's probably too late. But if I'm knowing that's why if I'm transitioning out and business school is a route, or I've transitioned out and I know I want to go to business school in a year, you need to start that early. So one, get your score set up and start to work those channels early and be persistent. You're going to get frustrated. And Mayshawn is correct. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to feel like nobody's trying to help me. But at the end of the day, you have to be your biggest advocate and you have to stay at that because you're entitled to it. And so if you stay at it and you work persistently at it, it will eventually come through. But you need to give yourself any of that stuff, probably 12 months, I would say, just to process. At a minimum, I would give it 12 months to process.
I think all great points. I'd say the other piece, right? VR&E and some of these benefits do vary by state as well. And so,
correct.
So
something tidbit that I'll add, even on that voc rehab. Let's say I live in Georgia, but I want to go to University of Texas at Austin. There's the state you're currently living in, and there's a process to get your case transitioned to that state because, to Mayshawn's point, it is that state office that is releasing the funding to support you for that university. I did not know that. I learned the painful way of that. And it's like you have to give itself time. You got to get approved by that office only to get shifted to another office. And all of that drags and takes time.
Yeah. And it can also vary by counselor too, even within that same office.
Correct.
But all great points because I wish someone had told me some of that because sometimes it can be a headache and a heartache. So especially if you're like, I'm getting out in August and I start school in September, just brace yourself.
Right. For sure.
We've covered a lot of good stuff today, Mike. I mean, you've dropped some amazing gems. Is there any other advice that you would give to future veterans? You know, you think back to, young basketball players or, engineer officers or Kappas, what advice would you give them that we haven't covered already or some other gems?
So I've dropped a lot of nuggets. What I want to give is confidence to folks. West Point has prepared you for a lot of things. Your Army service has prepared you for a lot of things. We've talked about a lot of these things that can supplement you. But if you're thinking about getting out of the military, there is one thing I will say is there's a lot of opportunity. Be confident in your abilities. There's, tactical things. If you learn how to network, learning how to write resumes, there's a lot of opportunity out there. So don't be afraid. You have the skill sets, you have the talents. Tap into your network. Use things like these podcasts to kind of help to reach out to people and build that network. But you're going to do well. There's tons of pathways out there, and that's what I wish somebody would have been telling me because I had doubt. I didn't have that kind of understanding that, man, that I can go out here and really do well. And so that's what I would say to you is trust in your abilities, be thoughtful, but then go out there and crush it. Go out there and crush it.
No, all great nuggets. And so if people want to follow up with you to learn more about, your search fund or Colorgraphy, where can they do that? Either on social media or websites, and then any other initiatives or things that you're working on, books, articles, all that good stuff.
So I'm on LinkedIn. So Michael Dames on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only Michael Dames out there, but feel free to reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. I am very deliberate about networking with other military veterans and West Point grads. And so feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's probably the start point. And then from there, we can swap information. And I'm more than willing to give up my time. My only ask, and Mayshawn knows this, when I talk to people is that they give up their time to the next person. So that's kind of my motto. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. And from there, I'm happy to exchange information and set up a time to talk.
Most definitely. Well, we appreciate your time, Mike. We appreciate all the great nuggets. We wish you all the luck with Colorgraphy and where you go to next.
Thank you.